There is a set of clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Gallery of the British Museum in London. They are small. The largest is approximately 15 centimeters across, roughly the size of a human hand. They are broken in places. Portions of the text are missing, sheared off by time or by the collapse of the ancient room where they were stored for millennia before excavation. What remains is written in Old Babylonian cuneiform, pressed into wet clay sometime around 1700 BCE by a trained scribe working in one of the great literary centers of the Mesopotamian alluvial plain. The tablets tell a story that predates even that ancient copy by centuries or more. A story about the gods who made humanity, the work those gods demanded, and the catastrophe that followed when the arrangement fell apart. The story is called the Atrahasis. It was first published in a modern critical edition by W. G. Lambour and A. R. Millard in 1969 through Oxford University Press. And there is a passage in the third tablet in the section describing the Great Flood that contains something most translations acknowledge, but very few scholars have been willing to discuss openly. The gods themselves are terrified, not satisfied, not triumphant, not watching from above with the calm detachment of beings who have chosen to execute judgment. Terrified, they cower, they weep, they press themselves against the outer wall of heaven like animals seeking shelter from a storm they did not expect. And the question that passage raises, what could make gods run, has not been answered seriously in any mainstream academic publication since Lambert and Millard brought it to light more than 50 years ago. The Atrahasis tablets are among the oldest coherent narratives in the human record. The physical objects in the British Museum date to approximately 1700 BCE, but the text they carry is older. How much older is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, with estimates ranging from a few centuries to more than a millennium. The language is Akkadian, written in the Old Babylonian script tradition, and internal references suggest the narrative draws on Sumerian source material that may reach back to the 3rd millennium BCE or earlier. The tablets describe three phases. First, the creation of humanity from a mixture of clay and divine essence. The Akkadian word is te'emah, rendered variously as flesh, blood, spirit, or rational understanding, depending on the translator. Humanity is made to serve as a labor force for the gods. Second, the growing population and noise of humanity, which disturbs the chief god Enlil and provokes him to send escalating punishments, plague, drought, famine. Third, the final catastrophe, a flood designed to wipe humanity from the earth entirely. That much is broadly agreed upon by mainstream Assyriology. What is not broadly agreed upon and what has generated the specific controversy this video addresses is the nature of the flood itself and the behavior of the gods during it. The Atrahasis does not describe an orderly divine punishment carried out by confident deities. It describes a catastrophe that overwhelms even its architects. Tablet 3 records the Anunnaki, the great gods, the children of the sky god Anu, ascending to the heaven of Anu in terror. The goddess Ishtar cries out, comparing herself to a woman in labor. The gods crouch against the outer wall of the heavens. They weep openly. The text uses language that Lambert and Millard translated with careful scholarly neutrality, but the implication is difficult to avoid when you read the passage without the assumption that it must be metaphorical. The gods did not send the flood with confidence. They fled from it. And the specific claim this video traces is the following. Zechariah Sitchin, in The 12th Planet, published in 1976, argued that the Atrahasis flood was not a divine punishment at all. It was a natural catastrophe, triggered by the orbital passage of a celestial body the Sumerians called Nibiru, that the Anunnaki could predict but could not prevent. The gods did not run from their own creation. They ran from something larger than themselves. And when you look at the mathematical structure encoded in a separate artifact, the Weld-Blundell Prism, a clay prism approximately 20 centimeters tall, held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford since 1922, the Numbers that emerge suggest the cycle that caused that catastrophe has not stopped. It has not been refuted. It has not been explained. And no published academic paper has answered the question of why the specific numbers on that prism behave the way they do when you divide them by the value the Sumerians assigned to the SAR. If you find that the academic literature on artifacts like this has been incomplete, if you suspect there are records still sitting in museums waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Atrahasis is well established and has been articulated by some of the most respected Assyriologists of the 20th century. It deserves a fair hearing because the alternative readings that follow are stronger when measured against a steel-manned mainstream view rather than a caricature of one. Samuel Noah Kramer, the pioneering Sumerologist who spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and who did more than perhaps any other scholar to bring Sumerian literature to a modern audience, treated the Sumerian flood narratives as mythological literature, stories a culture told itself to explain its origins, its suffering, and its relationship to the divine. Kramer's history begins at Sumer, first published in 1956, presented Mesopotamian literary texts as cultural achievements of extraordinary sophistication, but cultural achievements nonetheless, products of human imagination, not records of literal events. Leo Oppenheim, in his landmark study Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization, published in 1964, situated the Atrahasis within a broader tradition of Mesopotamian literary texts that served religious and educational functions within the scribal schools. For Oppenheim, the Atrahasis was a teaching text, a way of transmitting cosmological and theological ideas from one generation of scribes to the next. The flood was a narrative device with parallels across the ancient Near East, not a report of a specific historical event. Stephanie Dalley, the Oxford Assyriologist whose Myths from Mesopotamia remains a standard English translation of the major Mesopotamian literary texts, presents the Atrahasis as an origins myth that addresses two fundamental questions: why humans exist and why humans suffer. In Dalley's reading, the creation of humanity is a narrative explanation for the division of labor between gods and mortals. Humanity was made because the junior gods refused to dig canals, and someone had to do the work. The flood is a mythological response to the problem of divine displeasure with human overpopulation, a theme that recurs across ancient literature. The terror of the gods during the flood, in this framework, is a literary device. It heightens the drama. It shows the gods experiencing unintended consequences of their own decision, thereby humanizing the divine for narrative effect and offering a subtle critique of divine governance. The antediluvian king list on the Weld-Blundell Prism, 8 kings reigning before the flood for a combined total of 241,200 years, is treated by mainstream scholarship as symbolic. The numbers are seen as honorific, exaggerated for political or religious purposes, intended to convey the immense antiquity and legitimacy of kingship rather than literal durations of individual reigns. Stephen Langdon, who first translated the Weld-Blundell Prism in the early 1920s at Oxford, noted the extraordinary length of the reigns, but did not propose a literal interpretation. The consensus has held since then. The texts are literature, the numbers are symbolic, the gods are characters in a sophisticated theological narrative. And for decades, that reading has been treated as settled. In 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, the first volume of what would become the Earth Chronicles series. Sitchin was not an Assyriologist by academic training. He was born in Baku, Azerbaijan, in 1920, raised in Palestine, and educated at the London School of Economics. He was a journalist and researcher who had taught himself to read cuneiform over the course of decades, working primarily from published transliterations, sign lists, and the critical editions produced by scholars like Langdon, Kramer, and Lambert. His credentials were unconventional. His claim was specific. Sitchin argued that the Sumerian word sar which appears repeatedly in the antediluvian king list, and which mainstream scholarship translates simply as a large round number equivalent to 3,600, was not symbolic. It was a unit of time. Specifically, Sitchin proposed that it was the orbital period of a celestial body the Sumerians called Nibiru, a planet on a long elliptical orbit that passes through the inner solar system once every 3,600 Earth years. The idea was radical, but the mathematics that supported it were straightforward. If you accept the SAR as a literal orbital period, the antediluvian king list on the Weld-Blundell Prism transforms. The 8 kings who reigned for a total of 241,200 years were not being honored with inflated numbers. They were being measured in orbital units. Divide the total reign by 3,600. The result is 67, not 66.9, not 67.3, 67, an integer, and the individual reigns lengths show the same property. Each one is an exact multiple of 3,600. That mathematical regularity is the foundation of Sitchin's argument, and it is the specific claim that mainstream Assyriology has never directly addressed in a peer-reviewed publication. The significance of this integer result is easy to understate, so it is worth dwelling on what it does and does not demonstrate. It does not prove that Nibiru exists. It does not prove that the Anunnaki were physical beings. What it demonstrates, at a minimum, is that the antediluvian king list is not a random collection of impressively large numbers. It is a structured mathematical sequence built on a specific base unit. The question is what that base unit represents. Mainstream scholarship says the SAR is simply a large round number within the Sumerian sexagesimal system, a mathematical convention, like using thousand in English to indicate a generically large quantity. But this explanation has a weakness that its proponents have not addressed. In the Sumerian mathematical tradition, the sexagesimal system produces a hierarchy of round numbers: 60, 360, 3,600, 36,000, 216,000, and so on. If the scribes wanted to inflate king lengths using round numbers from their own system, they had many options. They did not use 60, they did not use 360, they used exactly 3,600, the specific value that Sitchin identifies as the SAR and interprets as an orbital period. The selection of that particular base from among all the round numbers available in base 60 has not been explained in the conventional reading. It is noted, set aside, and not returned to. Sitchin proposed an explanation. Whether his explanation is correct is a separate question. That the conventional reading lacks, one is not. Sitchin did not stop with the king list. He went back to the Atrahasis and read the flood sequence not as literary drama, but as a description, written by people who had access to an older oral or textual tradition of what happens when a large celestial body approaches on a predictable orbit. The escalating plagues described before the flood, drought, famine, pestilence, are consistent with the kind of environmental effects that a passing gravitational body would produce. Tidal stress on tectonic plates generating seismic activity, disruption of atmospheric circulation patterns causing drought, contamination of water sources through geological upheaval, the flood itself, sudden, total, arriving without the specific warning the gods could have given humanity, is consistent with a catastrophic tidal event triggered by close orbital passage, and the behavior of the gods, the fleeing, the terror, the cowering against the outer wall of heaven, is consistent not with beings who chose to send a flood as punishment, but with beings who knew one was coming, who had calculated its approximate timing, and who were afraid it would be more severe than their own models had predicted. This is the break in the reading. The gods did not punish humanity with the flood. They failed to warn humanity about a natural event they could foresee but could not prevent, and when it arrived, they ran. A second artifact adds a layer of astronomical specificity that is independent of Sitchin's linguistic claims. The planisphere of Nineveh is a circular clay tablet approximately 14 centimeters across, recovered from the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the great Assyrian library that was the largest repository of cuneiform texts in the ancient world before its destruction in 612 BCE. The planisphere is now held in room 55 of the British Museum. It has been there since the excavations conducted by Austin Henry Layard in the 1850s. The tablet contains a copy of an astronomical observation, a record of what someone saw in the night sky on a specific date, with the positions of celestial objects marked in relation to known constellations. For over a century, the tablet resisted confident interpretation. In 2008, Alan Bond, an aerospace engineer at Reaction Engines Limited, the company developing the Sabre propulsion system, and Mark Hempsall, a spacecraft systems engineer formerly at the University of Bristol, published an analysis of the planisphere. Bond and Hempsall are not ancient historians, they are engineers trained in orbital mechanics and astronomical computation, the mathematics of how objects move through space. Their approach to the planisphere was not philological, but computational. They treated the cuneiform markings on the tablet as data points, positions of celestial objects relative to known constellations and to the horizon, and fed those data points into modern astronomical software that can reconstruct the appearance of the night sky from any location on Earth at any date in the past. The software accounts for precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars to shift over millennia, which means that a specific arrangement of stars relative to the horizon corresponds to a specific date and a specific latitude of observation. Bond and Hempsall's conclusion was that the observations on the planisphere match the sky as seen from Mesopotamia on a specific date, June 29th, 3123 BCE. That is not a vague date. It is not a century or a millennium. It is a specific night, identifiable within the margin of error that precession calculations allow. Bond and Hempsall further argued that the tablet records not just a routine sky observation, but an unusual event, a celestial object moving across the sky in a way that does not match the behavior of any known planet or comet, and that is consistent with a large body entering the upper atmosphere on a trajectory that would produce a catastrophic ground impact. They connected this to the Kofels landslide in the Austrian Alps, a massive geological feature that has been difficult to explain by conventional geological processes alone. Whether the Kofels connection is correct is debatable. What is less debatable is the astronomical reconstruction itself, which is a mathematical exercise that can be independently replicated by anyone with the same software and the same input data. No competing reconstruction has been published. What follows from these readings, if they are even partially correct, reshapes the foundational assumptions of how we understand the oldest written records in human history. The first and most immediate implication concerns the nature of the flood itself. If the Atrahasis describes a real, astronomically triggered catastrophic event rather than a mythological punishment narrative, then the text is not literature in the way mainstream scholarship has categorized it for the past century. It is a record, a warning encoded in narrative form, shaped by the conventions of Mesopotamian literary tradition, certainly, and filtered through centuries of oral and written transmission, but a warning rooted in observation and prediction, not in moral theology. The gods did not decide humanity was too noisy. The Anunnaki calculated that an orbital passage was approaching and made a strategic choice: save themselves, leave the humans uninformed, and wait for the aftermath. The specific language of the Atrahasis supports this reading at a level that the literary interpretation struggles to match. The text does not say the gods were disappointed or regretful. It says they were afraid. The Akkadian vocabulary Lambert and Millard rendered in their 1969 edition uses terms associated with physical fear, bodily reactions, visceral distress, not philosophical regret. Ishtar does not lament a poor decision from a position of safety. She cries out in a way the text compares to the involuntary pain of childbirth, an uncontrollable physical response, not a considered emotional reaction. The gods do not observe from a comfortable vantage point. They crouch, they press against the outermost boundary of the sky. This is the language of beings who have lost control of a situation they thought they could manage. And the specificity of that language is what makes the literary device explanation less satisfying than it first appears. Literary devices serve narrative functions. Fear in a character heightens drama, but the Atrahasis does not use the god's fear for dramatic payoff. There is no moment where the gods recover their composure and pronounce judgment. The fear is the last thing we see of them before the narrative returns to Atrahasis the mortal, floating on the flood in the vessel Enki helped him build. There is no recovery scene. There is no divine council reconvening in composed authority to survey the damage and decide what comes next. The text moves from divine panic to mortal survival without transition, as if the gods have simply left the frame. When they reappear after the flood subsides and Atrahasis makes his offering on the mountaintop, they come to the smoke of the sacrifice like flies. The simile is in the text itself, not imposed by modern translators. The gods gather over the offering like flies. Lambert and Millard's translation preserves this image faithfully. It is an extraordinary way for a Mesopotamian scribe to describe the return of the divine, not with majesty, not with authority, but with hunger. These are beings who have been through something that diminished them. The language of the post-flood scene is as telling as the language of the flood itself, and it is rarely discussed in conventional analyses. Gods who return to the smell of burnt offerings like insects are not gods who have executed a controlled punishment. They are survivors, drawn back to the only source of sustenance available. There is a further dimension to this reading that deserves attention because it grounds the textual argument in physical geography. The Mesopotamian alluvial plain, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, is one of the most flood-prone landscapes on Earth. The rivers carry enormous volumes of sediment from the Zagros Mountains to the northeast and the highlands of what is now Turkey to the northwest. Spring floods were an annual occurrence in antiquity, and catastrophic flooding, the kind that could inundate entire cities and reshape the course of the rivers, is well attested in the geological and archaeological record. The city of Shuruppak, listed as the last of the 5 antediluvian cities on the Weld-Blundell Prism and named in the Atrahasis as the home of the flood hero, has been excavated at the modern site of Tel Farah in southern Iraq. Excavations in the early 20th century revealed a flood deposit, a thick layer of water-laid sediment separating earlier occupation levels from later ones. Similar flood deposits have been identified at at Kish and at other sites across the alluvial plain, though the deposits do not all date to the same period, which complicates the picture considerably. Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating at in the 1920s, famously encountered a thick layer of clean, water-deposited silt separating pre-flood and post-flood occupation levels, and declared he had found evidence of the biblical flood. Later analysis showed that the deposit at dated to a different period than the one at Shuruppak, and other sites showed flood deposits at still other dates. The conventional conclusion was that these were separate local river floods, significant events, but not a single catastrophic deluge. That conclusion may be correct for the individual deposits, but it leaves a question unanswered. The Mesopotamian scribes who composed and preserved the flood tradition were not ignorant of local flooding. They lived on a floodplain. They built their cities on artificial mounds raised above the waterline. Seasonal flooding was part of the agricultural calendar, and catastrophic flooding was a recurrent hazard they understood well enough to engineer against. If the flood of the Atrahasis were simply a large river flood, the kind of event the alluvial plain experienced every few centuries, it is difficult to explain why the scribes treated it as a singular, civilization-ending event rather than as another item in a long catalog of natural disasters they were already familiar with. The specificity of the Atrahasis flood, its totality, its cosmic scope, The terror of the gods suggests that the tradition preserves the memory of something categorically different from the seasonal or centennial floods the scribes knew firsthand. The point is not that one of these flood deposits is the flood of the Atrahasis. The point is that catastrophic flooding in this landscape is not mythological, it is geological fact. The question is whether the specific flood described in the Atrahasis, the one that terrified even the gods, was one of these periodic river floods or something of a categorically different magnitude. The text itself distinguishes between the two. The plagues and droughts that Enlil sends before the flood are local in scale and specific in mechanism. The flood is described in language that suggests totality, the whole earth covered, the boundaries of sky and water blurred, the gods themselves unable to see the ground from their position in the heavens. If this is poetic exaggeration applied to a river flood, it is exaggeration of an unusual kind, because the same text that supposedly exaggerates the flood describes the preceding plagues with clinical specificity. The register changes, the tone shifts, and the behavior of the gods shifts with it. During the plagues, the gods are in control. During the flood, they are not. That tonal distinction is present in every published translation. The second implication concerns the Weld-Blundell Prism and the chronological framework it encodes. The prism is a four-sided clay object, approximately 20 centimeters tall, inscribed on all four faces with a list of kings extending from before the flood to historical dynasties that can be cross-referenced with other archaeological and textual records. It has been at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford since Stephen Langdon first published his translation in the early 1920s. The antediluvian section lists 8 kings in 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuropak, with reign lengths that range from 18,600 years to 43,200 years. If these numbers are symbolic, as mainstream scholarship maintains, the symbolism has a curious and unexplained mathematical property. Every single reign length is an exact multiple of 3,600. Not approximately, exactly. The question is whether that mathematical consistency is coincidental or designed. Coincidence in mathematics is not impossible, but it is testable. You can calculate the probability that 8 randomly chosen large numbers would all happen to be exact multiples of the same specific value. That probability is vanishingly small. No published academic paper addresses why the scribes would have chosen multiples of a specific large number for their symbolic inflation rather than arbitrary large numbers, or why the chosen base, 3,600, happens to correspond to the Sumerian sar, a unit that appears throughout the Mesopotamian mathematical tradition. The first cross-cultural parallel enters here, and it arrives from a tradition separated from Mesopotamia by language, geography, and at least a millennium of independent development. The Book of Enoch, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, excluded from the Western biblical tradition at the Council of Laodicea in approximately 364 CE, and recovered in full only in the 18th century from Gea's manuscripts in Ethiopia, describes a class of divine beings called the Watchers. The Watchers descend to Earth. They interact with humanity. They teach forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, cosmetics, the reading of celestial signs, the interpretation of omens. And then they face judgment, but before the judgment falls, there is a description of celestial disorder that does not read like metaphor. Stars transgress their appointed courses, the heavens themselves convulse, the luminaries of the sky deviate from their established paths, the watchers know what is coming. And the text does not describe beings who stand in confident authority awaiting their sentence. It describes beings who have entangled themselves with earth and now face consequences they cannot fully escape or control. The structural parallel to the Atrahasis is specific and worth enumerating. Divine beings with advanced knowledge are present on earth. They have interacted with humanity in ways that exceed their mandate. They become aware of an approaching catastrophe linked to celestial mechanics. They are unable or unwilling to prevent it, and they flee, ascending, withdrawing, pressing themselves against the boundary of heaven before the catastrophe arrives. The Book of Enoch adds a detail that the Atrahasis does not contain explicitly, but that Sitchin's framework would predict. The Watchers possess knowledge of celestial mechanics. They teach humanity to read the stars, not as omens in the vague astrological sense, but as a system with rules, cycles, and predictions. The text presents this knowledge as dangerous, precisely because it gives humanity access to information about the structure of cosmic time, information that, in the Enochic framework, was not meant for human minds. If the Atrahasis describes gods who could predict a catastrophic celestial event, the Book of Enoch describes gods who gave some of that predictive knowledge to humans and were punished for it. The two texts, read together, describe the same situation from two different institutional perspectives, one focusing on the catastrophe itself and the gods' response to it, the other focusing on the unauthorized transfer of knowledge that preceded it. The geographic separation between ancient Mesopotamia and the Ethiopian highlands, where the Enochic tradition was preserved, is roughly 4,000 kilometers. The linguistic separation is total. Akkadian cuneiform and Ge'ez script share no common ancestry. The question of how two traditions, without documented contact during the periods of their composition, arrived at the same structural narrative, gods who came, gods who knew, gods who ran, is not answered by invoking coincidence. If you want to verify any of this, the artifacts are accessible. The Atrahasis tablets are catalogued and photographed in the British Museum's collection. The Weld-Blundell Prism is on permanent display in Oxford. Lambert and Millard's critical edition is in print and available through any university library system. Bond and Hempsel's planisphere analysis was published and can be checked against any modern astronomical software. The planisphere itself is in room 55 of the British Museum, where it has been since Layard's excavation at Nineveh in the 1850s. The evidence is not hidden, it is waiting. The academic response to Sitchin's reading of the Atrahasis and the Sumerian king list has followed a pattern that recurs across this field with striking consistency, and the pattern is worth examining not as a grievance, but as a structural observation about how academic institutions process heterodox claims. The response was not refutation, it was categorization. Within mainstream Assyriology, Sitchin's work is classified as pseudoscience or pseudo-archaeology. That classification has been applied broadly across his entire body of work without isolating specific claims for individual rebuttal. The 12th Planet, published in 1976, advanced a number of distinct and independently testable arguments. The Sar as orbital period claim, the reading of the Anunnaki as physical beings rather than theological constructs, the interpretation of the flood as an astronomically triggered event, the identification of Nibiru as a planet on a long-period elliptical orbit, and the reading of the creation narrative in the Atrahasis as a description of biological engineering rather than mythological symbolism. Each of these claims involves specific texts, specific numbers, and specific archaeological artifacts that exist in specific museums. Each is, in principle, falsifiable, and yet the published academic response has not engaged with the claims individually. What exists is a general characterization. Sitchin was not a credentialed Assyriologist. His readings are heterodox. His conclusions are outside the mainstream consensus. That characterization may be entirely accurate in its description, but characterization is not refutation. Refutation would require a different kind of work. It would require demonstrating where the specific calculation fails, showing that the rain lengths on the Weld-Blundell Prism do not, in fact, divide evenly by 3,600, or that the SAR has a documented alternative value that better explains the king list mathematics, or that the mathematical regularity is a known artifact of Mesopotamian number formatting conventions that produces apparent integer multiples without intentional design. No such demonstration has been published in a peer-reviewed journal. The silence on this specific point is not on all aspects of Sitchin's work. Occasional references appear in popular archaeology discussions, in book reviews, in general interest publications, and in online forums where credentialed scholars have offered general objections. but the specific mathematical claim that the antediluvian rain lengths are integer multiples of 3,600 has not been addressed in a peer-reviewed academic context. It has been filed alongside everything else Sitchin wrote and classified as not worth engaging with. The classification serves as the response. Bond and Hempsel's planisphere analysis received a different but structurally similar reception. Their book was published in 2008, with the astronomical analysis reviewed by colleagues in aerospace engineering and computational astronomy. The methodology was rigorous within its disciplinary framework. Modern astronomical reconstruction software applied to the cuneiform markings on a tablet that had been in the British Museum for more than a century without confident interpretation. The conclusion that the tablet records observations from a specific night in 3123 BCE, and that those observations include a celestial object consistent with a large body entering the atmosphere, was specific, dated, and falsifiable. Any astronomer with access to the same software can check whether the recorded star positions match the proposed date. The academic response was minimal. A small number of historians and archaeologists objected to the catastrophist implications of the analysis without engaging with the astronomical data itself. No counter-reconstruction has been published proposing an alternative date that better accounts for the specific positions marked on the tablet. No astronomer has published a paper demonstrating that the star positions Bond and Hempsel identified are incorrectly read or incorrectly matched. The pattern is consistent across both cases. When the claim involves specific numbers, specific dates, and can be checked with publicly available tools, the response is not a competing calculation or an alternative interpretation of the data. It is silence followed by classification, followed by exclusion from the conversation. The timeline of non-engagement is itself worth documenting. Sitchin published The 12th Planet in 1976. He continued publishing through the Earth Chronicles series for more than 3 decades, with each volume advancing new claims based on specific textual readings. His books have sold millions of copies in dozens of languages. The audience for his work is not small and not unsophisticated. It includes engineers, software developers, teachers, and military veterans who are accustomed to evaluating evidence and detecting nonsense. And yet, across nearly 5 decades of publication, the specific mathematical claim about the antediluvian king list, the integer divisibility, the SAR as a structural unit, has not been addressed in a single peer-reviewed Assyriological journal. Not to confirm it, not to refute it, simply not addressed. The absence is not neutral. In academic publishing, silence on a widely circulated claim functions as a position. It communicates that the claim is not worth engaging with, but the communication operates through absence, which means it can never be wrong, because a position that was never articulated can never be shown to have been mistaken. This is the structural advantage of dismissal over refutation. Refutation can fail. Dismissal cannot, because it never committed to a specific counterclaim. This matters beyond the individual claims of Sitchin or Bond and Hempsel, because it reveals something about the structure of academic engagement with heterodox interpretations of ancient texts. A structure that affects not only these specific researchers, but anyone who might subsequently want to investigate the same questions using better tools, more recent data, or different methodological frameworks. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims on their own terms. It requires showing where a number is wrong, where a translation is unjustified, where a methodology has a specific identifiable flaw. Dismissal requires only a label, and the label, once applied, functions as a barrier, not just against the specific researcher who attracted it, but against the question itself. The parallel to Avi Loeb is instructive and worth noting because it shows the same dynamic operating at the highest levels of mainstream credentialing. Loeb The Frank B. Baird Jr. Professor of Science at Harvard University and former chair of the Harvard Astronomy Department published a series of papers beginning in 2018 arguing that the interstellar object detected passing through the solar system in 2017 displayed properties: an unusual light curve, non-gravitational acceleration without a visible cometary tail, that were inconsistent with a straightforward natural explanation. Loeb's specific mathematical arguments were published in peer-reviewed astrophysical journals. His credentials are beyond question, and yet the response from portions of the astronomical community followed the same structural pattern observed in the treatment of Sitchin decades earlier: characterization of the claim as sensational, characterization of the researcher as seeking publicity without a published demonstration that his specific calculations were incorrect. The mechanism is the same. The institutional prestige of the researchers differs enormously. The outcome is identical. The question is not whether Sitchin or Bond or Himpsel or Loeb is correct. The question is whether the academic system has a functioning mechanism for engaging with specific, falsifiable, mathematically grounded claims that originate outside the current consensus, or whether the only available institutional response is classification and exclusion, because if the only response is classification, the claims are not refuted. They are unaddressed, and unaddressed is not the same as wrong. To understand what the Atrahasis describes, it helps to understand the world that produced it, not as a primitive backdrop to a mythological story, but as the sophisticated institutional context in which trained professionals recorded, transmitted, and debated the texts we now read as ancient literature. The tablets were inscribed in the Old Babylonian period, during the first half of the second millennium BCE, in the cities of the Mesopotamian alluvial plain, the flat, fertile, flood-prone land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. This was not a primitive civilization by any measure. Old Babylonian Mesopotamia was a literate, bureaucratic culture with a sophisticated legal tradition exemplified by the Code of Hammurabi, the great stele now housed in the Louvre in Paris, standing over 2 meters tall, inscribed with nearly 300 legal provisions. It had a complex religious hierarchy, administered through temple estates that functioned as economic as well as spiritual institutions. And it had a mathematical system of extraordinary precision, the base 60 numeral system developed in Sumer, which we still use today for measuring time in minutes and seconds and angles in degrees, which allowed calculations of a complexity that would not be matched in Europe for over 2,000 years. The scribes who copied the Atrahasis were trained in the Aduba, the scribble school, where they spent years learning to read and write cuneiform, to calculate in base 60, to compose literary Sumerian even when their spoken language was Akkadian, and to copy the great literary and scientific texts of their tradition with care and precision. These were not casual storytellers. They were trained technicians of language and number, working within an institutional framework that valued accuracy and preserved texts across centuries. The city of Sippar, where many old Babylonian literary tablets have been found, sat on the Euphrates in what is now the Baghdad Governorate of Iraq. It was a major center of learning and culture, particularly associated with the sun god Shamash, the divine patron of justice and truth. The Temple of Shamash at Sippar housed one of the great libraries of the ancient world, a repository of texts that included literary works, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, legal codes, and administrative records. These libraries were not passive storage facilities. They were active centers of intellectual work where scribes compared different versions of texts, annotated discrepancies, and in some cases produced critical editions that noted variant readings, an activity that bears remarkable resemblance to modern textual scholarship. The scribes who worked in these institutions did not merely transcribe. They were engaged in a centuries-long project of preserving, comparing, and transmitting a body of knowledge they considered important enough to warrant the considerable labor of cuneiform writing on clay. The later library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, built in the 7th century BCE, was explicitly modeled on these earlier libraries. Ashurbanipal himself, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, who reigned from approximately 668 to 631 BCE, was unusual among Mesopotamian monarchs in that he was literate in both Sumerian and Akkadian. His agents traveled across Mesopotamia, collecting tablets and commissioning copies for the royal library. When the library of Ashurbanipal was destroyed in the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE, its contents were buried under the rubble of the palace and preserved, accidentally, by the same destruction that ended the Assyrian Empire. It was from this library that Laird and his successors recovered the planisphere, the Enuma Elish tablets, the Gilgamesh epic, and thousands of other texts that form the foundation of modern Assyriology. The irony is considerable. The civilization that built the library was destroyed. The library itself survived because it was buried, and the texts it contains, including astronomical observations, mathematical tables, and flood narratives that describe gods in terror, are now accessible in a modern museum to anyone who wants to read them. The chain of transmission stretches across 4,000 years, from old Babylonian scribes copying the Atrahasis in Sippar to Ashurbanipal's agents collecting those copies for Nineveh, to Laird's excavators pulling the tablets from the rubble, to Lambert and Millard publishing their critical edition in Oxford. At no point in that chain did the text of the god's terror change. It was preserved because the scribes who transmitted it believed it mattered. The Atrahasis itself tells a story that begins before humanity exists. The Anunnaki, the great gods, the children of the sky, god Anu, have come to the earth. The Sumerian term is kai, meaning ground, land, or earth. They have divided responsibilities among themselves in a way that reads less like a mythological divine council and more like an organizational chart. Enlil rules the surface and the atmosphere. Enki rules the subterranean waters and the aquifer systems, the Abzu. Anu remains in the heavens. Below the Anunnaki in the divine hierarchy are the Agigi, the junior gods who are assigned the physical labor of maintaining the land, digging canals, clearing irrigation channels, the backbreaking infrastructure work that made agriculture possible on the alluvial plain. After what the text describes as a sustained period of forced labor, 40 years in some versions, though the number varies, the Agigi rebel. They burn their tools. They surround the house of Enlil at night. They refuse to work. The text describes something that reads remarkably like a labor strike, complete with collective action, confrontation with management, and a crisis that the existing power structure cannot resolve through force alone. The specificity of this scene is worth pausing on. The Agigi do not simply complain. They organize, they coordinate their action for a specific time, nighttime, when Enlil is asleep. They appoint a spokesperson. Enlil's vizier, Nusku, is sent to investigate and reports back with a description of the assembled crowd that reads less like a divine vision and more like an intelligence briefing. The question of who is in charge, who authorized the assembly, and what the assembled workers actually want is debated among the senior gods in language that mirrors administrative dispute resolution. Enlil weeps not from sympathy, but from frustration at a problem he cannot solve by command. Anu asks for a negotiated resolution. Enki proposes the creation of a substitute workforce. The entire scene operates within a framework of institutional hierarchy, collective, bargaining, and administrative problem solving that has far more in common with a Bronze Age palace dispute than with anything that would be called mythology by the standards of comparative religion. If the Atrahasis were discovered today without the weight of a century of classification behind it, it is not obvious that a fresh reader would file it under mythology rather than institutional history. The resolution is remarkable for its specificity and its resonance with themes that appear millennia later in other traditions. Enki, the god of wisdom, craft, and subterranean water, proposes that a new being be fashioned from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god. The god chosen for sacrifice is We'ilu, a rebel leader whose name carries overtones of rationality, intelligence, and understanding. The birth goddess Nintu shapes 14 pieces of clay, 7 male, 7 female. This is not the Garden of Eden. There is no single pair created in a paradise. There is a production batch of 14 workers manufactured to replace a labor force that went on strike. The divine essence, Tai-i-ma, is mixed into the clay so that the new beings will have enough intelligence to follow instructions, enough vitality to perform sustained physical labor, and enough of the divine spark to be something more than automatons. Humanity begins not in a garden, on a construction site. Time passes in the narrative. Humanity multiplies. The text says the noise of humanity disturbs Enlil. The Akkadian term is hubaru, often translated as clamor or uproar. The conventional reading treats this as a narrative device for explaining why the gods would want to destroy what they had just created. But the sequence of catastrophes that Enlil sends before the flood is specific, escalating, and internally consistent in a way that rewards close attention. First, plague, then drought, with the failure of rain and the drying of agricultural land. Then famine, as the drought persists and food production collapses. In each case, Enki, who sided with humanity during the creation debate, but who swore an oath to the divine assembly not to warn mortals of the gods' plans, finds a way to circumvent the prohibition. He speaks not to Atrahasis, the man, but to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house, knowing that Atrahasis will overhear. The legalistic precision of this workaround is striking. Enki does not break his oath to the assembly. He exploits a technicality. He warns not a person, but a wall, and the person happens to be listening. This is not the behavior of a character in a morality play. This is the behavior of an individual operating within a bureaucratic system, finding a loophole in an institutional prohibition. And in the final sequence, when the flood arrives, the text makes clear that this catastrophe is fundamentally different from the plagues that preceded it. The plagues were sent by Enlil. The flood overwhelms Enlil. The gods weep, they cower, they flee to the highest boundary of the heavens. The text distinguishes between the catastrophes the gods controlled and the catastrophe they did not. That distinction is the hinge of the entire narrative, and it is the detail that the conventional reading, which treats the flood as simply the last and largest of the divine punishments, has the most difficulty accounting for. Consider what it means for a text to distinguish between catastrophes that are controlled and one that is not. The Atrahasis does this with a precision that literary device interpretations tend to overlook. When Enlil sends plague, Enki tells Atrahasis to instruct the people to stop worshiping all gods except Namtar, the god of plague, and to direct offerings exclusively to him. The plague stops. The implication is mechanical, not theological. A specific intervention produces a specific result. When Enlil sends drought, Enki advises a similar redirection of worship toward Adad, the storm god. The rain returns. In each case, the catastrophe has a cause, a mechanism, and a remedy. The gods are operating within a system they understand and can manipulate. The flood has no remedy. Enki does not advise worshiping a specific deity. He advises building a boat. The shift from systemic intervention to physical survival preparation is itself a signal embedded in the text, a signal that the flood belongs to a different category of event, one that cannot be managed through the normal channels of divine administration. The scribes who composed and copied this text understood that distinction. Whether they understood it as literary contrast or as a record of a real difference in the nature of the events is the question. But the distinction is there, and it is deliberate. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Mesopotamian civilization is worth pausing on because it bears directly on whether the scribes who preserved the Atrahasis and the king list had the capacity to record real celestial observations, or whether their number work was purely symbolic. The Mul-Apen tablets, dating to approximately the 7th century BCE, but encoding observational traditions that are considerably older, contain systematic star catalogs listing the rising times of constellations along 3 parallel bands of the sky. The precision of these catalogs has been confirmed by modern astronomical reconstruction. The Mesopotamian scribes tracked the movements of the 5 visible planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, with enough accuracy to predict their positions weeks and months in advance. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, a record of Venus observations from the Old Babylonian period, roughly contemporary with the Atrahasis tablets, lists the dates of Venus's first and last visibility over a span of 21 years. Modern astronomers have used these records to anchor Babylonian chronology. The base 60 mathematical system, combined with the place value notation the Babylonians developed, allowed them to perform calculations involving very large and very small numbers with a facility that Greek and Roman mathematics could not match. When you read the antediluvian king list on the Weld-Blundell Prism and encounter numbers in the hundreds of thousands, the question of whether the scribes who wrote them understood large number arithmetic is not in doubt. They did. These were the same scribal traditions that produced the mathematical problem texts, clay tablets containing complex algebraic problems, geometric calculations, and astronomical computations that demonstrate a level of mathematical literacy comparable to early modern European standards. The question is not whether they could work with large numbers. It is whether the specific large numbers on the king list are arbitrary or structured. And the answer, the integer divisibility by 3,600, suggests structure. The Gilgamesh epic, particularly Tablet 11, provides a parallel account of the flood that illuminates the Atrahasis by comparison. In the Gilgamesh version, the flood hero is called Utnapishtim, the finder of life, and his account of the flood matches the Atrahasis in its essential structure, but adds details that deepen the picture. Utnapishtim describes building a vessel of specific dimensions, approximately 60 meters on each side, with 7 decks, waterproofing it with bitumen inside and out, loading it with his family, with craftsmen, and with the seed of all living creatures. The flood arrives, and Utnapishtim describes the reaction of the gods in language that parallels the Atrahasis, almost word for word. The gods cower. Ishtar cries out. The Anunnaki raise their torches, a phrase that has been interpreted as lightning or as the gods illuminating their own way as they flee through darkened heavens. A third version exists at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia. The Sumerian flood tablet, fragmentary, broken, with much of the text missing, preserves an even earlier version of the narrative in the Sumerian language rather than Akkadian. The fragments that survive contain the same core elements: a warning, a vessel, a flood, and the reaction of the divine. The existence of 3 independent textual witnesses to the same tradition, Sumerian, Old Babylonian Akkadian, and the later Standard Babylonian version incorporated into the Gilgamesh epic, means that the flood narrative and the god's terror within it are not the invention of one particular scribe or one particular literary school. They are a fixed feature of the tradition as it was transmitted across languages, centuries, and scribal centers. The convergence between the Atrahasis and the Gilgamesh versions is not simply a case of one text copying another. They represent parallel transmissions of what appears to be a common source tradition, a tradition in which the Asasar God's terror is a fixed element, not an invention of one particular scribe. Robert Schoch, a geologist and geophysicist at Boston University who holds his doctorate from Yale, has spent decades making a case that bears structural similarity to the pattern we see in the Atrahasis debate: specific, testable claims about deep antiquity, meeting institutional resistance that takes the form of categorization rather than engagement. Schoch's central argument concerns the Great Sphinx at Giza. The body of the Sphinx, Schoch observed, shows erosion patterns that are inconsistent with wind and sand, the dominant erosive forces in the Giza environment for the past 5,000 years, and consistent with prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. The vertical fissures in the limestone of the Sphinx enclosure, Schoch argues, are characteristic of water erosion, not aeolian weathering. The rainfall conditions necessary to produce those patterns last prevailed in Egypt before approximately 5000 BCE, with heavier rainfall characteristic of the period before 7000 BCE. If Schacht's geological observations are correct, the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years, implying that an organized civilization capable of quarrying and shaping monumental stone structures existed in the Nile Valley, in a period conventional archaeology considers prehistoric. Schacht's observations are physical, measurable, and tied to a monument that any geologist can examine. The response from mainstream Egyptology has not been a competing geological survey. It has been categorical rejection of the premise that any monument at Giza could predate the Fourth Dynasty. In Mpumalanga province in South Africa, Michael Tellinger has documented a stone circle site he calls Adam's Calendar, an arrangement of standing stones that Tellinger argues shows astronomical alignments consistent with a date of approximately 75,000 years ago. The dating methodology and the interpretation are contested, and Tellinger's broader claims about the site's purpose are unconventional. But the stones are real, the alignments are measurable, and the question of whether ancient stone arrangements in southern Africa encode astronomical knowledge that predates conventional civilizational timelines is testable. It is not a matter of belief, but of measurement and calculation. The pattern holds across researchers and continents. Specific testable claims about deep antiquity and sophisticated ancient knowledge are met not with competing measurements, not with alternative calculations, not with a demonstration that the specific observation is flawed, but with exclusion from the conversation. The Atrahasis tablets sit at the center of this broader pattern because they combine three kinds of evidence in a single tradition: narrative text, mathematical structure, and astronomical observation that are normally treated as separate domains. The text tells a story about gods who ran. The Weld-Blundell Prism provides numbers that divide by a specific value to produce integers. The planisphere provides an astronomical date tied to a specific night in the 4th millennium BCE. If any one of these three can be engaged with on its own terms, tested, falsified, or confirmed, the others become correspondingly more or less plausible. But when none of them are engaged with individually, the entire cluster of claims remains in precisely the same state it was in when Lambert and Millard published their edition of the Atrahasis in 1969. Unaddressed, unrefuted, and open. The Atrahasis is not the only ancient text that describes divine beings fleeing a catastrophe they could not control. The same structural pattern appears across traditions separated by oceans, by language families with no documented common ancestry, and by millennia of independent cultural development. The specifics of the pattern are more difficult to explain by coincidence or cultural diffusion than the conventional framework typically acknowledges, and they deserve individual examination. The Popol Vuh is the creation narrative of the Quiche Maya people, preserved in the highlands of Guatemala. The text as we have it was transcribed from an older hieroglyphic original into the Latin alphabet in the mid-1600s by Quiche's scribes who were literate in both writing systems. The hieroglyphic original has not survived. The Popol Vuh describes not one creation of humanity, but several, each ending in failure and destruction. The gods, the creators Tepu and Guchumats, make humanity from mud. The mud people dissolve. They cannot hold their shape. They cannot speak or worship. The gods destroy them and try again. The second attempt uses wood. The wooden people can speak, can move, can populate the earth, but they have no understanding. They do not remember their creators. They do not give thanks. The gods destroy them with a great flood. And the text adds a detail that echoes the Atrahasis in a way that should give any comparative mythologist pause. The wooden people's own tools and possessions rise up against them. Their grinding stones, their cooking pots, their hearthstones turn on them and crush them. This is not a simple flood narrative. It is a description of a world coming apart at a fundamental level, not just water rising, but the ordered relationships between humans and their environment collapsing simultaneously. The gods do not observe this destruction with satisfaction. They observe it with uncertainty. They try again. The third creation uses corn. These humans the current humanity, are successful. They can think, speak, worship, and understand. But the gods discover that these corn people can see too far. They perceive the world too clearly. They can see the gods themselves as they truly are. The gods respond by clouding human vision, limiting what humanity is able to perceive. The structural parallel to the Atrahasis is not in the plot details, but in the posture of the divine. These are not omnipotent creators executing a flawless plan from a position of total control. These are beings who experiment, fail, grow afraid of what they have made, and take corrective action that is itself imperfect. The detail about the gods clouding human vision deserves emphasis because it has no obvious parallel in the Atrahasis, and yet it echoes a theme that runs through multiple traditions. In the book of Genesis, after eating from the tree of knowledge, the first humans acquire awareness that the text presents as dangerous. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers teach humanity knowledge that is explicitly forbidden: the reading of celestial signs, the forging of weapons, the use of plants for purposes the text does not fully specify. In each case, the divine response to humanity knowing too much is not destruction but limitation. The gods do not eliminate the dangerous knowledge, they restrict human capacity to use it. The Popol Vuh frames this as a literal reduction in visual acuity. The corn people's vision is misted, like breath on a mirror. The implication across traditions is consistent. Humanity once had access to a kind of perception or knowledge that the divine found threatening, and that access was deliberately curtailed. Whether this reflects a shared cultural memory, a common psychological archetype, or something else entirely, remains an open question. But the specificity of the parallel across cultures with no documented contact is harder to account for than the generic observation that many cultures value forbidden knowledge. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the four Vedas and among the oldest religious texts still in continuous liturgical use, contains hymns composed in Vedic Sanskrit that scholars date to between approximately 1500 and 1200 BCE, though the oral tradition they encode may be substantially older. The Vedic cosmological framework includes the concept of the Mahayuga, the Great Age, a cosmic cycle of creation and dissolution spanning 4,320,000 years. The Mahayuga is divided into four sub-ages of decreasing duration and increasing disorder: the Satya Yuga, the Treta Yuga, the Dvapara Yuga, and the Kali Yuga. The tradition holds that humanity is currently in the Kali Yuga, the age of strife, decline, and spiritual darkness. At the end of the full Mahayuga cycle, the universe dissolves in the Pralaya, the great dissolution, and is recreated. What is significant for this discussion is that the gods themselves are subject to this cycle. They do not stand outside it. Even Brahma, the creator deity, exists within a framework of cosmic time that encompasses his own eventual dissolution and renewal. The specific numbers within the Vedic system reward the same kind of attention that the Sumerian king list rewards. The Mahayuga spans 4,320,000 years. Divide that by 3,600, the Sumerian Sar. The result is 1,200. An integer, the Kali Yuga alone spans 432,000 years. Divide by 3,600. The result is 120. An integer. The correspondence between the Sumerian Sar and the Vedic cosmic cycle may be a mathematical coincidence, but it is a coincidence that involves a specific number, 3,600, appearing as a structural unit in two numerical traditions separated by more than 2,000 kilometers and at least several centuries, with no documented historical contact during the periods when their earliest mathematical and cosmological frameworks were being formalized. The Vedic system does not use 3,600 as a named unit in the way the Sumerian system does. The correspondence emerges only when you divide the Vedic cycle lengths by the Sumerian unit, an operation that neither tradition would have performed on its own, because neither tradition knew the other's mathematical vocabulary. The fact that the operation produces integers in both cases is either a property of the numbers themselves or a property of the underlying reality those numbers were designed to encode. The conventional explanation that both cultures independently developed number systems in which large cycles happen to share a common factor is possible but grows less satisfying as the number of independent traditions displaying the same mathematical property increases. One coincidence is unremarkable. Two is notable. Six traditions across six continents sharing structural elements that can be reduced to a common numerical framework is a pattern that invites explanation rather than dismissal. The Yoruba Ifa divination corpus, transmitted orally across West Africa for centuries and now recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, describes the Orishas, divine beings who descended from the heavens to establish the foundations of civilization on earth. The supreme deity, Olodumare, sends the Orishas to shape the world, establish governance, and teach the skills of survival: agriculture, metallurgy, medicine, the reading of signs. And then, across various Odu, the verses and chapters of the Ifa corpus, the Orishas withdraw. They do not die. They ascend. They return to their origin, leaving humanity with the tools of civilization, but without the continuous, direct presence of the divine. The Dogon people of the Bandiagara escarpment in Mali, documented by the French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germain Dieterlen beginning in the 1930s, preserve a cosmological tradition centered on the Nomo, beings described as amphibious, associated with water, who came from the region of the sky near the star the Dogon call Sigitolo, identified by Griol and Dieterlen as Sirius. The Nomo taught the Dogon astronomy, agriculture, and social organization before departing. The Dogons reported knowledge of the Sirius system, including the existence of a dense companion star orbiting the main star in a period of approximately 50 years, a companion not visible to the naked eye and not confirmed by Western astronomy until the 19th century, has been debated for decades. Conventional explanations include contamination from European missionaries or visiting scientists, coincidental similarity, or selective reporting by the French researchers. But the narrative structure is consistent across traditions. Beings of advanced knowledge arrive from the sky, teach civilization, and withdraw before or during a period of upheaval. The Hopi people of northeastern Arizona preserve an oral tradition describing a sequence of worlds, each destroyed and recreated. The first world was destroyed by fire, the second world by ice, the third world by water, a flood that covered the earth. Each time, a remnant of humanity is warned in advance and guided to survival by a divine protector. But the destruction itself is not fully controlled by the divine. It arrives as a consequence of cosmic imbalance, and even the protectors can only warn and guide. They cannot prevent what is coming. The Hopi tradition is particularly significant for the diffusion question because the Hopi people have inhabited the mesas of northeastern Arizona continuously for over 1,000 years, and their oral traditions, transmitted through a formalized ceremonial system that treats accuracy as a sacred obligation, describe events and structures that predate any plausible contact with Mesopotamian or Near Eastern cultures. The specificity of the Hopi destruction sequence is also notable. The destructions are not generic apocalypses. Each one involves a specific element and a specific mechanism. The fire world is destroyed by volcanism, the ice world by glaciation or polar shift, the water world by flooding. The sequence progresses through states of matter and through geological processes that are independently attested in the Earth's climatic record, whether the Hopi were encoding actual geological memory, transmitted across tens of thousands of years through oral tradition, or independently arriving at the same cosmological framework as the Sumerians through parallel reasoning about the observable world. The correspondence is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. The pattern across these traditions, Mesopotamian, Ethiopian, Quiche Maya, Vedic, Yoruba, Dogon, and Hopi, is not the generic observation that many cultures have flood stories. That observation is true but uninteresting. The specific structural elements that recur are what demand attention. Divine beings with superior knowledge arrive on Earth, establish or create human civilization, become entangled with the human world, foresee a catastrophe tied to cosmic forces larger than themselves, and withdraw before it arrives. The conventional explanation for these parallels is cultural diffusion, a single origin narrative that spread and mutated as human populations migrated. But diffusion models work best when a plausible transmission route exists. Between ancient Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica, between the Vedic tradition and the Hopi, the documented contact during the relevant periods is zero. What the diffusion model would require to account for all six traditions is a common ancestor narrative old enough to predate the geographic dispersal of all the cultures involved, a source tradition from a period deep enough in human prehistory that it could have traveled with migrating populations to every continent. And that, in turn, requires a civilization old enough and sophisticated enough to be the source. Which brings the question back, with uncomfortable precision, to the Weld-Blundell Prism and its 241,200 years. The strongest published objection to Sitchin's framework comes not from mainstream Assyriology, which has largely declined to engage at the level of specific claims, but from Michael Heiser. Heiser held a doctorate in Hebrew and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and spent years constructing a detailed critique of Sitchin's linguistic arguments. His work deserves a full and fair hearing because it represents the kind of specific engagement that the debate requires. Heiser advanced three principal objections. First, he argued that Sitchin's translation of the Sumerian word Nibiru was incorrect. In the cuneiform texts where Nibiru appears, Heiser contended, the word refers not to a specific planet on a long period orbit, but to a concept of crossing or transition, a point in the sky, a ford or crossing place, not a celestial body, with physical properties and an elliptical trajectory. Second, Heiser argued that Sitchin's reading of the Anunnaki as physical beings from another world had no basis in the cuneiform lexical tradition. The Anunnaki in the standard Sumerian sign lists and the bilingual dictionaries that Akkadian scribes compiled as reference tools are categorized as divine beings, Dingir, within a polytheistic theological framework. Nothing in the lexical record, Heiser maintained, supports reading them as extraterrestrial visitors rather than as gods. Third, Heiser objected to the methodology itself, arguing that Sitchin worked primarily from published transliterations rather than from original tablets, and that his readings frequently diverged from the consensus of trained cuneiformists without providing adequate philological justification for the divergence. These are serious criticisms, and they deserve to be taken seriously precisely because Heiser did what most of Sitchin's academic critics did not. He engaged with specific texts, specific sign readings, and specific translation choices rather than relying on categorical dismissal. His linguistic critique has genuine force. If Nibiru does not mean what Sitchin claimed it means, the planetary hypothesis weakens. If the Anunnaki are consistently categorized as Dingir in the lexical tradition, the physical being's reading is harder to sustain against the weight of the cuneiform record, but Heiser's critique has a boundary, and the boundary matters. Heiser addressed Sitchin's translations. He addressed the linguistic arguments. He did not address the mathematical structure of the Sumerian king list. The question of why the antediluvian rain links on the Weld-Blundell Prism are all exact multiples of 3,600 does not appear in Heiser's published work. That question is not a linguistic claim. It is an arithmetic observation that can be verified by anyone with the published numbers and a calculator. Similarly, Heiser did not engage with Bond and Hempsel's planisphere analysis, which stands entirely independent of Sitchin's linguistic framework. It is an astronomical reconstruction based on orbital mechanics, not a cuneiform translation. The current state of the debate, then, is genuinely unresolved, and it is unresolved in a way that should trouble anyone who values intellectual honesty, regardless of which side they find more persuasive. The linguistic critique has force in its domain. Heiser demonstrated real problems with specific Sitchin translations, and those problems cannot be waved away by pointing to the mathematical evidence on a different artifact. Linguistic claims must be defended on linguistic grounds, and Sitchin's linguistics were, in several documented instances, indefensible by the standards of professional cuneiform scholarship. But the mathematical regularity remains unexplained by any published analysis, mainstream or otherwise. It sits in a different evidentiary domain, arithmetic, not philology, and it does not depend on any particular translation of Nibiru or any particular reading of the Anunnaki as physical beings. You do not need to accept a single word of Sitchin's translations to observe that the antediluvian reign lengths are integer multiples of 3,600. That observation is independent of the linguistic framework. It predates Sitchin. The numbers have been published since Langdon's translation in the 1920s, and it will persist regardless of whether Sitchin's name is attached to it. The astronomical reconstruction of the planisphere remains similarly unchallenged by any competing date or alternative interpretation. And the question the Atrahasis raises, why the gods behaved as they did during the flood, why they ran, remains unanswered by any single framework that accounts for all three kinds of evidence: textual, mathematical, and astronomical. If the Atrahasis texts describe a real, recurring, astronomically driven catastrophic cycle, one that the Anunnaki could predict in its broad timing but could not prevent or fully control, then the Sumerian scribes who copied those tablets in the Old Babylonian period were not preserving mythology, they were preserving a warning. And the implications of that possibility extend well beyond the interpretation of a single ancient text. If the antediluvian chronology on the Weld-Blundell Prism encodes real durations measured in orbital units of 3,600 years, then organized civilization on Earth extends back not 5,000 years, but tens of thousands. Or if the full span of 241,200 years is taken at face value, into a depth of time that conventional archaeology has no framework to accommodate. The standard timeline of human civilization, cities arising in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, writing developing around 3200 BCE, monumental architecture appearing in Egypt around 2600 BCE, would represent not the beginning of complex society, but its most recent iteration. The history taught in universities and presented in museums would cover only the latest chapter of a much longer story, most of which has been either lost or misclassified as mythology. The implications for archaeology, for anthropology, for the study of human origins would be transformative. Every site currently dated to the Neolithic would need to be reevaluated not as a beginning, but as a recovery. The first traces of a civilization rebuilding after catastrophe, not the first civilization. The megalithic sites of the world, Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, and already difficult for conventional archaeology to explain. The massive stone platforms at Baalbek in Lebanon, whose quarried blocks weigh over 1,000 tons, and whose construction method remains undetermined. The precisely fitted stonework of Sacsayhuaman in Peru and the underwater structures off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan would move from being anomalies requiring special explanation to being expected features of a world with a much deeper history of organized construction. The Anunnaki, in Sitchin's reading, were not omnipotent deities. They were a technologically advanced civilization, powerful enough to engineer a labor force from existing biological material, knowledgeable enough to predict celestial mechanics across millennia, sophisticated enough to build institutional structures that persisted for thousands of years, but not powerful enough to prevent the physical effects of an orbital passage they could see coming. They were beings who calculated, who prepared, who weighed the options, and who still ran when the event exceeded their ability to contain it. And the cycle they ran from, if it is real, if the SAR marks a genuine orbital period and the mathematical structure of the king list encodes genuine interval, has not completed. It is still operative. The orbital mechanics that would produce a 3,600-year return period do not stop because the beings who tracked it left, or because the civilization that recorded it fell. An orbit is a physical reality governed by gravity, mass, and the geometry of space. It does not pause because a civilization falls. It does not stop because the beings who tracked it departed. It continues whether or not anyone is watching, whether or not anyone remembers. The artifact is real and it is in a museum. The numbers are published, and they have been since the early 1920s. The mathematics can be checked by anyone with a calculator and a copy of Langdon's translation. The question has been open for a century. No one has closed it, no one has tried. The Atrahasis tablets are in the Mesopotamian Gallery of the British Museum. They have been there for more than a century. They are small enough to hold in one hand. They are older than every empire that came after them. Lambert and Millard published their critical edition in 1969. Sitchin published his reading in 1976. Bond and Hempsel published their planisphere analysis in 2008. The Weld-Blundell Prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where it has been since 1922. It is approximately 20 centimeters tall, inscribed on 4 faces in Sumerian cuneiform. It lists 8 kings who ruled before the flood for a combined reign of 241,200 years. Divide that number by 3,600. The result is 67. It is an integer. No published paper has explained why. No counter-calculation has been offered. No alternative mathematical reading of the king list accounts for the regularity. The Atrahasis describes gods who did not punish. It describes gods who ran. The passage is in Tablet 3. The language has been translated and published. They cowered. They wept. They pressed against the outermost wall of the sky, what they were running from. And whether it follows a cycle that has not yet reached its end is a question that has been open since Lambert and Millard first brought those tablets into the light in 1969. It is still open now.